Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
Christ coming to liberate the captives, give freedom to people. So Martin Luther King was religious in that sense. And I really believe, therefore, he becomes a model for this type of ministry that I'm calling liberating activity.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Sister Pat Schnapp, who is a doctoral student at Bowling Green State University. Father Bacik and Sister Schnapp will discuss ministry as a liberating activity. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Pat, as some people know, you have written an ode recently that refers to the life of the host of this show. And I just want to assure you that I am not giving you time to read that ode on the program and to make all those attacks on me that you have in the past. I really want to discuss something else, if that's all right with you.
Oh, I found a private way of circulating it anyway, Jim, so go ahead.
You're not going to read that ode on the radio, I hope.
Well, unfortunately, I didn't bring it with me.
Good. I want to talk about ministry, which is a very live topic in the church today. I wrote an article recently where I made the claim that there's more intelligent ministry going on now in the church than probably any time in history. I really don't know if that's true.
But who can disprove it, right?
That's right. I'm sure somebody can. But I believe that there really is a real rebirth of interest in ministry these days. I think it's often obscured by the idea that we don't have enough priests, or there aren't as many people entering religious orders. So people think that, oh, we don't have ministry. But I would say with the really flourishing of the lay ministry, people going to programs to learn how to be ministers, people in parishes doing all kind of things from visiting the sick to doing things at the liturgy, to working on social justice and so on. There just is a whole lot of activity, so many generous people who want to come forward and to serve in one way or another. I don't know if that word ministry is a strange one or not, but it does capture a lot of what is going on. It suggests the idea of service, of reaching out to others, of doing for others. It also suggests that one is doing it not just on one's own, but as a representative of the community, as being sort of deputized. Usually we figure that people will have a little bit of training to do this kind of ministry, enough that they can function effectively in their task in life. So, and the goal of it, in one way or another, is to spread the kingdom of heaven, to create the community of love on this earth, and to make the presence of the Spirit more available to people, so that ministry has those kinds of notes to it, and there's a lot of it going on, and many people interested in it. I presume you run into people like that who are caring about ministry and want to do more of it.
In all my circles, that tends to be true. I was thinking as you were enumerating some of the forms of ministry that are flourishing in the church today, certainly the one of lay retreats, I think, needs to be noted. On the parish level, the college level, we have frequent retreats where the laity, the members of the parish, plan, give the talks, share their own religious experience, very often their own conversion experiences or pivotal experiences, personal experiences in their own lives, and thereby share their faith journey with one another. And it seems that this is one of the newer forms of ministry within the Catholic community, and one that has revitalized a lot of parish communities and brought in members or brought members to the desire to minister in other ways beyond that of the occasional retreat, but to get involved in the parish in one of the other forms of ministry that you mentioned, that very often it begins in the context of one of these parish retreats.
Right, and it goes on at all levels. We see it happening in high schools and colleges and all over.
Right.
And I think one of the things that perhaps it leads into then is a greater awareness of the social dimension of the Gospels. And I think when the whole movement is done right, then we get another sense of ministry, what I often call liberating activity. Ministry as an attempt to establish justice in the world, to get at peace, to overcome the systemic evil in the world. So out of all of these forms of ministry, I suppose that's the one that's most difficult to establish. I suppose we could end up saying that very often people, it's hard to recruit people for that side of it, where you can get people to come to retreats or to do prayers and so on, and to be involved in the liturgy. It seems much more difficult to get people involved in working for peace and justice. So I believe that when we start looking at that kind of ministry, that we're dealing often with a small core group of people committed to the causes and immersed in the movements, and often hitting their head against a wall as they try to engage more people in this activity. So let's talk a little bit about this liberating activity, the ministry of liberation. There might be better words for that, but what I'm referring to when I say that is the ministry for peace and justice and the reverence for life, the attempt to establish justice and overturn the oppressive structures in the world. I know you yourself have, that's been a ministry that's been very important to you, and so perhaps we can talk a bit about it.
Okay, first I think maybe it would be well to distinguish between what we sometimes call social work, social action, meaning perhaps collecting food or clothing for the poor and taking it to them, and then involvement in what you refer to as systemic evil or political activity, perhaps working to change unjust systems that are behind or that are partly the cause or entirely the cause of the poverty that is being treated. It seems to be a fairly easy matter in most parishes and schools to muster students who are willing to become involved in some sort of direct service to the disadvantaged, the waifs, whatever we might call them. And there certainly is a great deal of gratification in delivering food baskets at Thanksgiving, which will be happening again soon, of course. At the same time, this doesn't really change the systems. It's probably the easiest form of involvement, of social involvement, and the most personally gratifying, but it doesn't get at what is seen as the roots of the problems of the poor, and the other forms of somehow working to establish peace or to establish justice are more long-term, less personally consoling, comforting, and maybe a little bit more demanding of the long-term commitment that's going to be required to try and see any actual results.
So you've distinguished between a social service, in a sense, visiting a nursing home and taking food to people, distinguish that from the effort to change institutions, to get policies changed and laws established, and to get structures in place that help to free people and liberate people. And I think that is a valid distinction. And I also buy your point of saying it's easier to get people involved in the one, that is the social outreach, in a sense. But however, the other one remains very important, and I suppose one gets a stronger sense of that liberation element in the theology based on the social gospel these days, that the kind of thing we get from Latin America, where it is so clear that the structures imprison people, where the classes are so sharply distinguished, and the people at the bottom are powerless and can't get hold of things and so on. But I think also in the United States we can think in those terms as well. I think it's not just Russia where we would like to see things changed, or in Brazil, but in the United States as well. And I often go back to Martin Luther King and talking about liberating activity. I find it fascinating that in all the liberation theology literature you almost never read about Martin Luther King. Although that might be changing in some of the black liberation literature, which you are very familiar with. But I would like to see him raised up more, because I think he's got great things to say. Because let's look at what he did and how he went about it. I mean, he operated nonviolently. He figured he's going to change the structures here in the United States that are oppressing blacks, other minorities. He's going to go after those institutions. He's not just going to give a handout to people. And he decided to do it nonviolently, that he's going to use methods that really accord with the gospel of Jesus Christ. I always remember that line after his house was firebombed in his speech when he said, they will not make me violent. I will not let those people pull me down to their level of violence. And so he insisted on that with his followers in the civil rights marches in the South, the sit-ins. And I suppose the interesting thing about all of that is that it worked. I mean, that it was part of a social movement here in the United States. It gave us the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. And we, I think most people would agree, we made great progress during that time in dealing with the problems of minorities in our country. So Martin Luther King's appealing to me in many ways, and I find it curious that he's not mentioned more in a lot of the authors who deal with liberation theology. And I don't know why that is. One thing is he did not use Marxist categories particularly to do his analysis, but I figure the Marxist categories don't fit here anyway. I mean, they're great in Latin America, where you have that clear kind of economic exploitation and so on, but it's always been hard to get Americans to make much sense out of that class analysis that Marx gave us. So anyway, Martin Luther King did not use that a lot in his own analysis. So what he used really was the American dream, and said we're not living up to the dream, and we ought to be. I ought to give you a chance to talk. I got carried away there for a while.
Where do I begin? Well, do you want me to respond?
Whatever.
Whatever.
Please.
All right. I think Martin Luther King probably is not held up as much as you would like to see, and I would like to see, because at some point he was very uncomfortable with Stokely Carmichael's cry for black power, and he really disassociated himself from that. I think he felt it would be very alienating, it would be divisive, and he wanted to stick strictly to the platform of nonviolence, whereas many other blacks, maybe the more secular branch of the civil rights movement, was crying out for black power and looking for political power, and not using the religious categories that Martin Luther King was most comfortable with. I think the final consensus today seems to be that both were needed, both approaches were needed, Martin and Malcolm, as they often put it.
Well, I would want to argue that Martin Luther King had a great sense of getting power. I mean, he knew that people had to have power. I mean, maybe he didn't like the slogan, but I mean, I think that he understood that you weren't going to make any progress until the underclass, or the people who were economically deprived and on the margins, had power, who could take hold of things themselves. And I think he was constantly educating people to do that. I think he had a marvelous sense of that.
The militant stance of some of the members of the civil rights movement that made him feel somehow that there would be a greater backlash if they kept up their militant rhetoric. And I think this is perhaps why those who perhaps have more admiration for the militant branch, or the secular branch of the civil rights movement, give less credit to Martin Luther King than he deserves.
I think that he did work within a religious framework,
yes.
And I think that's what gives him his staying power, in a sense, and allows him to rise above the pettiness that was often found. He really did operate out of the Christian symbol system. He was very taken by Gandhi. He clearly learned something about nonviolence, about from the great Salt March of Gandhi. That was influential on his own thinking, but his really dominant symbols were the Christian ones, and Jesus Christ's own care for the poor, for the outcasts, and the whole gospel message of trying to live out this the social aspect of it, that we believe in a God who is with the people and wants the people to be free. Marvelous touching of the freedom symbols of the Scriptures. the Exodus idea, Christ coming to liberate the captives, give freedom to people. So Martin Luther King was religious in that sense. And I really believe, therefore, he becomes a model for this type of ministry that I'm calling liberating activity, because he wanted to go after the system, to change the system, and in many cases succeeded in doing so while following the precepts of nonviolence given to us by Jesus.
Right, right. I think one of the things that he contributed, and of course liberation theology was hardly in the birthing stage, not really at the time that Martin Luther King was most active, but one of the things he contributed was the looking at the gospel story from the perspective of the oppressed, in this case of the blacks, who have always identified with the chosen people while they were in bondage in Egypt and were led out of bondage by Moses. And there are those who, of course, have associated Martin Luther King with Moses leading the people to freedom. I think this has been borrowed by other groups who have been oppressed and who again want us to look at the reality of society through their eyes and not through the eyes that we tend to see with, which is the eyes of those, in my case, your case, the comfortable middle class, but rather to simply view reality from a totally different perspective and try to see what reality is experienced as. And it's this sort of crawling into the shoes of people who are oppressed, whether they are gay or black or Native American or women, that we find ourselves recognizing the problems and at the same time beginning to have our conscience tweaked about the necessity of dealing with the problems.
Yes, and I think that he really did that well. Part of it was the consciousness-raising aspect of it, the educating of the American public about the problem, getting the facts before people. And your point about reading the gospel from the viewpoint of those on the margins is extremely important. I consider to be one of the great insights of the liberation theologians,
right.
Because all theology has been written from the dominant class before, by people in universities who had positions of privilege and power, all kind of perks and so on, and it could only see the world through those eyes. And so what these people have done, those who have raised consciousness and said, try it the other way. What does the Bible look like from the viewpoint of a welfare mother? I tried to give a talk one time along that line. If you just read through the New Testament as a person on welfare whose children don't seem to be getting a break, and you got to stand in line, and you're not treated with dignity, and so on, which passages jump out at you from the New Testament? It is just very different, and that is a very good exercise for people if you to get into this whole liberating activity. And then I think we bring it down to a level where we all should be involved. You stressed earlier the idea that it's it's not very satisfying often to take on institutions and systems. I mean, we usually end up losing. The culture is powerful, and we're fighting against great odds, and therefore it becomes hard to sustain the effort. But I think that there are a lot of people in the ballgame and who are trying, usually these core group of committed activists. I mean, you and I, working with college students over many years, have seen people like that. I always think of the student who was worked for the rights of the American Indians during his university days. I mean, he was a lone voice. I mean, he was hardly anyone else around thinking that way. And then he went on to work for the Bureau of Indian Affairs and so on, and really has made, I think, a contribution that way. And so we know people like that who've been involved in the peace movement. You know, they're at all the organizing rallies, and they're getting flyers ready, and they're making phone calls and trying to get conferences organized, and all with often with slim results, not many people showing up and no great action. But these people are impressive. So it's not just Martin Luther King, but he is the drum major for justice, and I suggest that means that he's leading other people. And all throughout Christian history, and then Judeo history with the prophets and so on, we've had these people who have been able to galvanize some others into action. And so people say, well, I'd like to live like that, or that's a good way, or that the gospel has that social dimension for me too. I think I'll get with it and try to see if I can't work on one or the other problems: poverty, peace, racial harmony, the situation in the jails, so many different kinds of activities that one can do. So my point is that there's a lot of that going on, not as much as we'd like to see, but these few people who are committed are tremendous inspiration, at least to me.
Right.
And you're in touch with some of those people,
right.
I know. And
Right. And I think one of the differences between, again, to go back to what I was saying earlier about social action versus, involvement in the systems is that in involvement with unjust systems or in concern for the oppressed that desires to somehow change the status quo, there has to be involvement with some level of where the power resides. Somehow there has to be an impact on ordinarily, typically, on some law, on some political stance, on some level at which the injustice continues to be perpetrated. And this leads into, of course, such things as writing letters, as going down to city councils, as getting signatures, petitions to have certain laws changed. This requires a lot of legwork, a lot of time, and a lot of doing homework. And I would say again, that's the challenge, perhaps, is that if one wants to affect the system, one has to do a lot more homework than one does to put food items in a basket or toys in a basket and deliver them to a welfare mother at Christmas time. Although that is a good action, and I don't want to put that down or say that should not also be done. But it does seem to require a different kind of discipline, the discipline of getting one's facts, of finding out how the political system works and at what level one enters it, becoming acquainted perhaps with one's congresspeople and writing them, visiting their offices, etc., learning what lobbying is all about, what groups are dealing with this particular issue, what groups then can I support, what is the best time to try and impact the system, etc.
Yeah, I like your idea of discipline and the notion that there's a different type of discipline involved in all of this. It's a discipline of intellect in one sense, of learning,
yes.
Getting the facts. It's not enough to be a person of goodwill when you're trying to do ministry of liberation. One also has to be a person of knowledge and know how the system works and where the power lies and how you get leverage on that power. And it's not for everybody. I mean, not everybody is going to be involved in that way. Not everyone is a political animal.
Right.
And you need a certain, I think, interest in that and an ability to move in that world. One of the things that happens, of course, is you get your hands dirty. That is, it's not a pure world. It's a world of compromise very often and coalition building and drawing other people in. I mean, we see that in the peace movement. I mean, today it seems to me the action in the peace movement is expanding the pool of people who are interested in working that way, so that candidates could get up and say that they are for reducing expenditures on weapons and for more outlay for the poor and to help themselves, and I mean handing out to the poor, but programs that will really give power to the poor and let them take hold of their own lives. Anyway, we want a climate politically where candidates could get up and say that. And we have to broaden out the base, therefore, of peacemakers in the world, or people who see the world in that way. But I'm just picking up on your point that it's an intelligent effort, a prudential effort that is needed in this type of ministry. And also the long haul needs to be worked at. And that brings up, I think, the model of Jesus again. In all ministry, Christ, for us Christians, is the guide, the model, the example of how to go about it. And I suppose it is in Luke 4 that we begin to get this idea of Jesus as the liberator, the one who came to free the captives. It's a favorite passage of liberationists. Jesus gets up in the synagogue and identifies himself with the prophet who will come to do these good things, to preach the good news to the poor, and to free up people, to liberate. It's often said Jesus didn't directly attack the establishment, and I think there is a truth in that. But his message had an impact, and they knew it, and that's why they eventually had to get rid of him, or felt that that was their only course of action. So Christ, again, the model of the liberating ministry. Yeah. I
was going to say that I think perhaps one of the problems that prevents many people from becoming involved in changing systems is, I'm afraid, a prevalent notion in the United States that the poor deserve to be poor. They're poor because they don't hustle. They're lazy. They're inert. They want a free ride somehow. They're not willing to pay their dues. That many of the forms of oppression that we are somehow aware of, we tend to feel people bring upon themselves in some way, and that it's important to dispel these myths in order to bring more people on board, to get them concerned and involved, and to recognize that, in fact, people don't ask to be oppressed, that there are many factors in life that simply the people have no control about, that somehow cumulatively result in their being on the bottom of the economic barrel. And maybe it's a lack of educational opportunity. Maybe it's coming out of a home where there's never been academic support in school. Maybe it's having had no models in the home. Perhaps it's poverty that has been in a family from generation to generation, which disables one from going on for higher education and the opportunities that will open up. It can be many things. But I think the myth that people, for instance, to take just one category, that people who are on welfare somehow are unworthy of the kind of efforts that are needed to change the system, prevails in the United States today.
That's a good example of what I would call false consciousness existing in our country, or in any place really, and the need to dispel that. That is, when you're in a system, the symbols of that system are ingested into your consciousness. You begin to think in those terms. They become the only way that you have of thinking. They're your dominant categories. And that very often, I think, is what creates this situation that you're talking about. That, in other words, you simply assume that people on welfare are lazy, and without really getting at the facts or realizing that most people on welfare can't work and are unable to work and so on. So you've raised that whole question of ideology. Pat, I know you have a lot more to say on this notion of ministry as liberating activity, but I think that we have to sort of try to pull this together in some way. We're talking about Martin Luther King as an example of liberating ministry, one who attacked institutional evil, tried to get at the root of the problem, and wanted to empower others to take hold of their own lives. And then we've tried to see that, well, that pertains to other people as well. There's a lot of people around involved in this kind of ministry, and I suppose what you and I want to do is foster that, encourage it, and try to get more people to do it. And one of our best means of doing it is the example of Jesus, who did indeed come to liberate the captives.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked with Sister Pat Snap, who is a doctoral student at Bowling Green State University. The topic of this week's Reflections was ministry as a liberating activity. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Minister, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo. Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
Ministry of formation is a vital one. I suppose a lot more of it goes on than we ever imagine. What about the teacher who just simply does a good job and the student says, they care? Or the coaches who function like this?
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Sister Pat Schnapp, who is a doctoral candidate at Bowling Green State University.